Hey everybody, hope that we're all doing well and that, well, judging by the energy in our first sort of exchanges and conversations about narratives, not only in our last video workshop, but also in particular in what's happening in our stories and roots. It's really good to see. First of all, one of the things that this new module does is it allows us to sort of track down and hopefully write about something that we already have an interest in or that we're excited about, and that maybe in your more normal, if you will, classroom, you may not have had a chance to write on. So let's say there's a graphic novel that I really like, or a podcast that I've always really enjoyed, or a manga, or a particular film or television show, or a particular book, or a particular Broadway play, whatever it might be. I can write about that. I can analyze it and develop a sort of perspective and point of view, which we're going to talk about in coming workshops. But the other thing that this module does ideally is that it allows us to bring these things and share them, these narratives, these different narrative ideas. So not only ideas in terms of what are narratives, how do they work, how do they have a kind of social function. That's something that obviously we have already begun talking about in light of Jeremy Shu's article, The Secrets of Storytelling, but also in terms of our opening discussion boards here. But also just in terms of us bringing our different interests as far as narratives are concerned. I always end up at the end of this module, the few times that I've done it, I always end up at the end of this module with a longer to-do list, meaning things that I want to watch, things that I want to listen to, things that I want to read, things that I want to see. And that's often thanks to you all. So without further ado, I want to get right into today's workshop, which is going to focus in on sort of what I promised in our last video workshop, was what exactly is meant by this idea of a non-traditional narrative, and how do we begin to, how is that going to help us analyze our selected narrative? So part of our job this week, before we go into spring break, is to try and decide upon a narrative we want to write about. So Stories and Roots is all about brainstorming different possibilities. You obviously don't have to choose whatever you wrote about in that discussion board as your focus for your essay, but you can do something totally different now. But it's Stories and Roots is really, we keep in mind that we want to be focusing in on only just one narrative, though we wrote about two in Stories and Roots. That was just to give you some sense of different ideas you might have. But again, you're welcome to choose whatever narrative you like. When it comes to the essay, we're only writing about one narrative. We're only analyzing and making an argument about one narrative in our essay. So keep that in mind, right? So let me get right to the start of this discussion regarding non-traditional narratives, and get right into the slideshow here, and hopefully that looks okay. I'm not sure if I can make my face bigger on this. One thing I noticed in the videos is that my face is kind of this teeny little thing up in the corner, which is fine. I have no vanity here. I'm not saying that it's good to look at me, but sometimes perhaps it's you can sort of see me talking can be helpful, perhaps. So to start off, our module is obviously M2 Narrative Futures, and I want to start off with bringing back the kind of the prompt from our M2 overview, right? So for our second module, M2 Narrative Futures, we'll embark on an investigation into a selected non-traditional story and analyze the message and effect we feel our selected story has upon its audience, as well as the consequence of that message. Then make an argument about what we see as the larger significance of that message for our society, what we learn that is of importance from this new storytelling experience about a certain social issue. So there's a lot going on there. And so over the course of these next two video workshops, I'm going to try and unpack that. But a couple things to notice right off the start. Number one, we're doing two things here. We're writing an argumentative analysis, a critical analysis. So we're going to analyze the message and effect we feel our selected story has upon its audience, as well as the context, the consequence of that message. And we're also making an argument. So your argumentative analysis, naturally, we're analyzing and we're making an argument. But this argument should be about what kind of larger significance we see the message of this narrative having upon a certain social issue or issues. So that argument stuff and even the analysis stuff is something that will continue to develop here. But as you can see, there's a lot in that statement that we want to make sure we understand, and obviously feel free to ask questions about. One way to do this or handle this a little more readily is by just sort of, kind of doing a step-by-step process. And like I said at the top of this video, selecting a narrative is the first part of that process. And how do you choose a narrative to write about? Well, based on your own interest. What's something that you're interested in? Or particularly if you feel it's something that's really distinct and non-traditional. Usually you want to write about something that is distinct because that means you probably have ideas about how it's doing something that's a little bit different, or at least it's doing something that's notable. It's something that we should take a closer look at. The other thing I wanted to say here is maybe choosing a narrative based on a particular social issue. So let's say I'm really interested in issues of feminist politics, or issues of gender, or issues of masculinity, or issues of third genders, or non-binary notions of gender. Then maybe I want to try and find a narrative that really taps into some of those ideas. Or maybe I'm interested in issues of race and ethnicity. Maybe in particular, I'm interested in issues of the discrimination and marginalization of African Americans in our society. Well, then I want to maybe think about, I can use that issue as a way to sort of go find stories that I think I'm interested in writing about. So thinking about the kind of social impact, the specific social issue that I choose is going to help me focus my analysis and my argument. And this isn't to say that you can only have one social issue. You might have a couple social issues intersecting, but they should, it should make sense, right? I don't want to write a paper that's, half of it's writing about race and racism, and then the other half's writing about, gender. It's not that I couldn't write about gender and race, but I need to show how they're intertwined in setting up that paper. Or, half the paper is about gender, and then half the paper all of a sudden is about, government corruption. Your reader gets a little lost, and the paper will tend to be too sort of sweeping and broad. But we'll get into that. How do we use social issues to help us focus? The third thing, like I mentioned, is we're going to be thinking about the message of the narrative and the effect of that. That's part of analysis. And then the larger significance of that message, which is the argument. For now, though, I want to keep us on these first two pieces, right? Like I said, kind of taking it step by step. Let's not overwhelm ourselves and sort of get in over our heads. Let's just start with thinking about a narrative to choose, and then maybe thinking about what social issues. In fact, I would still say, for the most part, this video workshop is going to focus on number one and get into a little bit of number two here. So let's move forward. One of the questions that we ended last video workshop with, as far as non-traditional narratives, is why are we writing about a non-traditional narrative? And I mentioned three things at that time. It allows us to write about something that we're interested in. It allows us to write about something perhaps that has more currency, that is happening now. And then it allows us to think about significance. It allows us to develop or understand a notion of significance of how stories are meaningful. The question that I want to sort of address more with this video workshop is a little bit of a tweak of that, which is, what is a non-traditional narrative? And this is actually a question that I brought up and talked a little bit about both in the bonfire discussion and in the video workshop, the VW4, but I kind of want to take it on more in full here. So let's really sort of make that the framing question for this lesson today, this video workshop. What is a non-traditional narrative? And this, if you remember, on the homepage of our class in Canvas, there's a quote by Chinua Achebe who talks about this idea. Well, I'll just read the quote. Wherever something is, something other also is. And I think it is important, whatever the regimes are saying, the regimes meaning the people in power or the institutions of power, that the artist keeps themselves ready to enter the other plea. Now, what I think is interesting about this quote is that Achebe teaches us two things. One, that there's never just one story. I mean, that's perhaps something that is obvious, but and there might be certain stories that are elevated and it seems like there's only one story, but really there's other stories that need to be paid attention to, and it's kind of the artist's job to make sure that those things are paid attention to. The other thing that Chinua Achebe's quote does is show us how there's difference, right? That there's maybe narratives that we're used to, and there's narratives that are other, that are non-traditional, if you will, that are off the beaten path, if you will. So there's two ways then that I think this quote sort of helps us. I'm going to come back to this quote in just a second, but two things, generally speaking, category wise, that can help us think about how narratives are non-traditional. One is in terms of content, right? Which is basically to say what the narrative is about, what it contains, what is the story, what are the characters in the story, what are the social issues that it addresses. The other way that a story can be non-traditional is in form, which is to say how the story is told and through what medium that story is told. So these are two more general categories, content and form, that we're going to kind of open up into a little bit more detail here. I'm not going to cover every single subcategory, if you will, but when we're talking about the content of our narrative, we're talking about the theme, the genre, perhaps the style, the issue or issues that are at stake. And then we're talking about the form of a narrative. We're often talking about its structure, the medium through which the narrative is communicated. So a podcast is a different piece of media or medium than a film, obviously, that is different than television, that is different than a book, that is different than a graphic novel, that is different than a play, that is different than an art installation. Those are all different media, right? And then of course sequencing, which is something that structure and sequencing are also parts of form, right? So one of the first things that I think it was Josh talked about in response to VW4, our last video workshop, was the first thing that was non-traditional, was non-chronological narratives as being non-traditional, and that's very much a part of a non-traditional form of sequencing. Is traditionally stories are sequential or chronological, I should say. So those are the things that we're going to get into a little bit of content and form, and thinking about those things with a little bit more depth. The other thing, like I said, that Achebe points out is other versus regime, and this is going to lead us to talk about master narratives. When we ask a question like, what is a non-traditional narrative? It implies another question, which is, well, what is a traditional narrative? In that case, I mean, if we're going to, we need to know the law. If we're talking about law breakers, we need to know what the law is. And in many ways, traditional narratives are narratives that we can sort of connect to this idea of master narratives that actually came up in Jeremy Shu's article about the secrets of storytelling. So we'll touch upon that as well. So let's begin, like I said, with these ideas of content and form. And I kind of want to just bring in some general examples to sort of illustrate these things. In particular, I want to talk about sort of the films of Alfonso Cuarón, or just two films. Now, in 2018, Alfonso Cuarón came out with a film called Roma. And up to that point, I think people were really surprised, or at that time when Roma came out, people were really surprised by the film, because Cuarón was noted for creating kind of blockbuster films. So here you have a screenshot from his film Gravity, which I think was maybe 2015. No, it was before that. It was probably 2012. Anyways, it doesn't really matter for the point of what we're talking about. But this is, so we have, very familiar faces here in terms of the actors, George Clooney and blanking on her name right at the moment. But we have very familiar actors here. I can't believe I can't come up with her name right now, but that's okay. I'm sort of, my train is on a different track at the moment than thinking of movie stars. But, we have this storyline that's really kind of big and expansive, this outer space adventure, and it's George Clooney and whatever this famous actress's name is, I forget, forgive me. It'll come to me later in the middle of the thing. So Quaron, in many ways, we could see in terms of the content of the film, Gravity, it's very we could arguably it's very traditional, right? It has these very familiar actors. It's a love story. And it's big, it's epic, it's in space, and we're used to our films doing that. However, in 2018, Quaron came out with a very different film called Roma. And in terms of content, here we have a story that's focused in on not a sort of familiar storyline. We have the storyline of a domestic worker, female domestic worker, working for a wealthy family or a wealthier family in Mexico. And we don't have any sort of recognizable star actors, as you can see in the screenshot below, right? We don't know any of these. We don't have George Clooney here. We don't have any famous actors that are, in a traditional sense that we're used to. With the film is also in black and white. The film is also entirely in Spanish. And so all these things are very, well, non-traditional if we think about what we're used to seeing up to this point in terms of Cuarón's films. So the content, and I haven't even said anything about the form of these two things. And for now, I just want to focus on content. But you can see how the content of Roma was quite a switch, and it was quite non-traditional if we think of what we're traditionally used to seeing in terms of Hollywood films. Let's take a look at another example, recent film by Regina King called One Night in Miami. Now, it's the story of One Night in Miami, where Malcolm X, Jim Brown, the football player, and Muhammad Ali all ended up hanging out together in a hotel room in Miami, or spending a night in Miami. And in some sense, this is so the top image you're seeing here is the image that it's an actual image from that night. We have Malcolm X taking the photograph here behind the camera. The bottom image is the film remake of this moment. Now, the content, in terms of films being based on real events, is not something necessarily non-traditional. It seems like a lot of the movies, in fact, if you look at a lot of the Academy Award winners recently, a lot of them are based on true stories. Now, what is different here, though, I think, is a couple things. One is we have this focus upon African American males, and as much as they're celebrities here. I think it's Sam Cooke. Sorry, Sam Cooke is also in the film. As much as they're celebrities here, they're not people that we know them through their celebrity factor. We know them through perhaps even documentary films about Muhammad Ali or whatever. But here we have this kind of very day-to-day story between these figures, right? That are well known, but here they're sort of treated as regular, guys, if you will, regular human beings. They're obviously not regular human beings in the eyes of society, but here we see them acting regularly with one another. So those two things, the fact that it's focused in on first kind of African American men as the central focus of the film is, I would say, non-traditional. We haven't had a whole lot of films that are focusing just on the lives of African American men or an African American man, much less to say anything about African American women. That, of course, is not the rule, but in many ways, we've had a lot more stories about sort of Western whites than we have had about people of color. But the second thing is also that we're seeing these people in a kind of everyday way within the film. So the content of Regina King's film, we could say, as being really non-traditional. Again, it's not that something needs to be dramatically different, right? But we're kind of using this non-traditional idea to get us to understand how does our particular selected narrative challenge or get away from a kind of master narrative. Now, so master narratives, they're also known as grand narratives or meta narratives. A master narrative is something that is well, this is from an article talking about what a master narrative is. And as a master narrative is a totalizing cultural archetype that orders and explains knowledge and experience. Such master narratives make up the mythological structure of a society and thus serve to legitimate knowledge, legitimizing the existing power relations, customs, etc. of society, allowing us to derive comfort from the stories we tell and which may be uncomfortable to dispute. Sorry, I have some typos in there, or lack of capitalization. But a couple things that are really important here is that a master narrative is a narrative in some sense that kind of like is normal. It's a narrative that sets the rules of the road. It's a narrative that legitimizes knowledge. It's a narrative that we're comfortable with, right? The happy ending narrative, the narrative of that doesn't challenge doesn't challenge social issues in many ways, right? So what do master narratives usually look like? Well, if we're talking about the West, they follow, like we talked about just a little bit before, they follow a kind of familiar chronological sequence: the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? We can often, we can say that in terms of sequence and structure, the narratives that are normal or traditional are those that have a beginning, middle, and end, and they go in chronological order. However, there's all kinds of ways we can structure and sequence narratives. In fact, Navajo storytelling, Native American Navajo storytelling, has this idea of circular structure where you start and end in the East. So how would that look like in terms of a novel, or how would that look like in terms of a film? It's a really kind of interesting question. It's obviously something that's very different, or quite different, from a traditional chronological sequence. So Freytag's pyramid, which gives us kind of what is the kind of master narrative structure, the structure that we're really familiar with in terms of narratives, and we can see we have kind of, exposition, right? Setting up the characters, introducing everybody. Then we have like an initial incident and rising action to a climax, falling action, resolution, and then a French word, denouement, which means the sort of tying up of loose ends. And so this is something that we're very familiar with. And you might have noticed this. Let's say you're watching a movie or reading a novel, or reading a graphic novel, or watching a TV show. You realize that, oh, there isn't exactly this kind of rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, denouement structure. If it breaks that familiar structure, we often are like, wait a minute, we don't get to know what happened, or there's no happy ending here, or there was never really a moment of just a singular climax. We can think about how sequence and structure, the way narratives can play with those things, are ways in which they can be non-traditional, right? And we can start thinking about this in terms of, and this comes from Jeremy Shu's article, right? He says Jonathan Gottschall is one of the literary Darwinists who assert that story themes do not simply spring from each specific culture. Instead, literary Darwinists propose that stories from around the world have universal themes reflecting our common underlying biology. So the two more common, sorry, my two more common prototypes are romantic and heroic scenarios. The former focuses on the trials and travails of love, whereas the latter deals with power struggles. The third prototype, dubbed sacrificial by Hogan, focuses on agrarian plenty versus famine, as well as on social redemption. These themes appear over and over again as humans create narrative records of their most basic needs: food, reproduction, and social status. So here we have this sense in which theme, we have romantic, heroic, and social redemption. We have this idea of theme really playing a role, and that some of our most familiar and traditional stories are either romance stories, heroic stories, or sort of stories of social redemption. So thematically, Chris Booker kind of takes this further, right? Talking about the kind of 7 basic plots or themes that we see in narratives. And the reason I want to point these out is because we can sort of look how, maybe a narrative we're interested in writing about fits one of these themes or fits one of these story structures, but maybe plays with it or changes it a little bit or revises it. So for Chris Booker, there's like you said, 7 basic plots. No surprise there because of the title of the story. So rags to riches is, and this could be kind of a redemption theme, if you will. So he talks about Aladdin, right? Aladdin's homeless. Aladdin meets a magical genie. He uses the genie to destroy Jafar, and Aladdin and Jasmine restore peace to the kingdom, right? So rags to riches being a kind of theme that's very sort of traditional or familiar. Overcoming the monster, right? So we have peace and calm. We have a inciting incident. So it's very much a hero narrative. Resolves the conflict after a battle, a climax, and then a happy ending. So overcoming the monster is what Chris Booker calls that. That's very familiar in terms of a kind of heroic narrative. Voyage and return, right? The Wizard of Oz, travel to another world, feel threatened, trapped, overwhelmed, sudden return with new perspective of life, initial circumstances improve. The 4 other ones he talks about are the quest. So he talks about the Lord of the Rings, right? Hero sets out on a journey, encounters troubles, completes the mission, and peace is restored. The tragedy, like Requiem for a Dream, the protagonist is tempted in irrational behavior, experiences unsustainable success, fails to fully achieve his goals, and the downward spiral. Not a happy ending here for sure, but a kind of tragic story. And of course, tragedy is a very familiar theme or a very familiar genre, which we'll look at in a second. Comedy, so Dumb and Dumber, again. And then lastly, a rebirth, which also could be kind of a redemption story, talking about Groundhog Day. So what Chris Booker is doing is sort of talking about how these are kind of narratives that we are very familiar with. And so how do certain films fit into certain narratives fit into these things, and how do they sort of challenge them, change them, revise them, or do something different in terms of their, non-traditionality? Now, the other thing I mentioned was the notion of genre. And genre is, you've probably heard that phrase before, is, if we look in the dictionary, is a category of artistic composition, as in music or literature, characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. So genres we're probably quite familiar with, action, crime and gangster, horror genre, war, westerns, musicals, dance, drama, adventure, comedy, epics, historical, science fiction. Oftentimes we categorize narratives into various genres. In fact, according to Statista, the most popular US genres of film, of course, this is not talking about other media, but of film in particular, up to 2019, adventure, action, drama, and comedy were the sort of top 4. Thriller and suspense, if you want to, top 5. But so those are the kind of top 4, with things like reality, which is kind of interesting, that reality genre is literally almost non-existent, or it's way down at the bottom, we should say. Which is kind of fascinating. So anyways, genre is something that, of course, we can take a look at as understanding traditionality versus non-traditionality. So I want to take one of those genres, which is the gangster film, and start sort of taking a look at how the gangster film, or the gangster narrative, and I'm going to be looking at films in particular, how the gangster genre is something that is very much evolved and changed. And we can see how specific narratives really do something different, and kind of, they make their mark, if you will, by, taking the gangster genre and doing something a little bit separate. So here we have, like on the left, 31 and 32, The Public Enemy and Scarface. And this is really the early sort of ethnic gangster, right? As is The Godfather, which is to say that the gangster genre really began with, the early 20th century, when at the turn of the 20th century, when we had a huge influx of immigrants, particularly European immigrants, into major cities, and then them trying to find ways to strengthen and support their communities in the face of discrimination. So you have the Italian mafia, of course, the Irish mob, all these different groups that The Public Enemy and Scarface are about, really focusing on. And then Godfather, of course, is the kind of culmination of the ethnic gangster, if you will, for lack of a better term. Then jump ahead quite a bit in time when we come down to 1983, 1991, and 1999. 1983, we have Scarface. Now, it's the same Scarface movie story, if you will. We're going to take a look at story in a second. But here we have a kind of different kind of immigrant, if you will, right? The Cuban immigrant. Scarface is Cuban, and the story takes place primarily in Florida. It's a different kind of look, if you will, to the familiar gangster genre. Boys in the Hood in 1991 really kind of began what you might call the racial gangster movie. Or some people have called that. Todd Boyd is a researcher and writer who writes a lot about this in interesting ways. But Boys in the Hood took the gangster film, the gangster genre, and brought it into, in this case, South Central Los Angeles, and taking a look at the African American gangs, predominantly African American gangs and Latinx gangs in Los Angeles. But in Boys in the Hood, in that case, it's African American predominantly. And then The Sopranos, of course, is another sort of evolution of the gangster genre. Here you kind of have this very interesting switch. Yes, we have the kind of Italian mob. Of course, it's the Italian mafia in contemporary times. But now we have like the gangster's family, right? So you have Tony Soprano, but then the show is very much obviously about Tony Soprano, but it's also very much about his family, his daughter, his son, his wife, his mother. And there's almost like some comedic aspect. Not to mention, the other thing that The Sopranos did is it brought in this kind of psychoanalytical aspect. If you remember, Tony Soprano, that character is seeking treatment for his mental health. And he's having these kind of anxiety attacks and everything. That's a very different move away from the traditional gangster of 1931 or 32, if you will. So can see in terms of genre, and that's just pulling a few apples out of the bucket, if you will. I'm just taking a look at a few examples. And once we started thinking about like the gangster genre, well, it's not maybe that The Sopranos is revolutionary, though arguably it was pretty revolutionary for the gangster film. We see a lot of these kind of I think a lot of shows that really take a lot from The Sopranos. But doesn't have to be that it's dramatically different, but that there's ways in which these different films are building upon or revising or evolving, I should say, the genre of gangster films in different ways. Speaking of gangster films, of course, is West Side Story, which is perhaps one of the most canon gangster films or gangster stories, I should say. So if West Side Story, of course, began as a stage play, and it's a show between two gangs, the Sharks and the Jets. And the Sharks, I believe, are a Latinx gang, and the Jets are, I think, an Anglo gang, a white gang. And in the original film, okay, this is not the original play, but the original film, you had Natalie Wood, a white woman, playing Maria, who was a Latina or supposed to be a Latina. So we had this kind of interesting problem, to say the least. Really kind of something to think about, the way in which this white woman is playing and representing a Latina in that film. Now, but the story of West Side Story is something that's very familiar. Just recently, West Side Story has been redone. So here we have West Side Story. We have that idea of the story taken and adapted and made into something that addresses more our current context, issues of race in particular, sort of being on the forefront. A younger sort of crowd and audience, not such a Hollywood vibe, if you will. Once again, there's also a stage play, Wrestling with West Side Story. This is the cover of New York Times Magazine. Oh, it's probably, well, you can see it was, maybe a year ago. Right. It says, inside the audacious, high stakes remake of one of the most beloved musicals in Broadway history. And you can see how this remake, right? We have, a very different, the Tiburon, which of course is Shark and Espanol. We have this remake, this redoing of that story. So West Side Story is one of the most familiar kind of archetypical, it's a master narrative, right? It's that archetypical sort of gangster story that is getting remade and redone. And of course, we can't Steven Spielberg, of course, just released his own West Side Story. And one of the big shifts, if you will, compared to the 1950s Natalie Wood West Side Story, is that he actually cast, or the production team cast, Latinx people in the roles that there were written as Latinx roles. So it's kind of bringing that in some sense full circle, maybe some kind of justice, maybe some kind of redemption, whatever you might want to think about it. But again, Steven Spielberg created another iteration of West Side Story. So story is another way. One last example I want to look at, and then we'll kind of wrap up, is Alejandro Iñárritu, who is another Latino director that you're probably familiar with. But he recently created, Academy Award winning. He recently created a multimedia installation called Carne y Arena, which I believe is like meat and sand, or blood or arena. And it's a virtual reality kind of experience. So we talked about content, we talked about form. Here we're really talking about medium. And this is where I want to sort of, this is another way that things can be non-traditional, right? Virtual reality is a whole different medium than film, which is Alejandro Iñárritu's, if you will, traditional or normal, whatever, most familiar medium. In fact, this is the first time he'd ever done anything with virtual reality. And there is aspects of film in it, but there's also aspects of obviously virtual reality. There's also aspects of sort of, using an actual space, an actual physical space, and physicality as being a big part of this. So this medium creates a very different experience. And just to sort of give you a sense of it, I wanted to bring in a description. You enter alone into a cold waiting room that evokes the holding cells where migrants are kept. By the way, the content of Carne y Arena is about the experience of migrants, particularly migrants from Mexico and South America, trying to escape hostile and difficult and life-threatening circumstances, and therefore being, essentially forced to leave their country to find a better life and to save their families. So that's the content of the narrative. But this is how it happens, right? It's very different than reading a novel about it. You enter alone into a cold waiting room that evokes the holding cells where migrants are kept. There you deposit your belongings. A jarring alarm calls you into the main room, a darkened chamber with a sand-covered floor where assistants strap you to a heavy backpack and VR rig. Then the real experience begins. You're plunged into the Sonoran Desert at sunup alone. A small cluster of migrants trudges towards you across the barren plain, but just as they join you and you begin to feel acclimated to the woozy virtual terrain, helicopters and immigration enforcement trucks thunder in from the distance. What ensues is a chaotic, punishing encounter where men and women and children are thrown to the earth, threatened with guns, and eventually hustled away. Excuse me. At one point, the mirage-like apparition of a long table appears in the desert, upon which floats the specter of a sinking boat, a reference to the Mediterranean migrant crisis. Throughout the experience, whenever you accidentally pass through any of the virtual bodies, your VR goggles are filled with the momentary image of a floating, beating heart. A nice symbolic way to deal with such inevitable reality-breaking collisions amid the frenzied action. So a very different kind of narrative here. And it's the medium in this case, okay? It's the medium that is really providing for the non-traditional experience, though there's other things that are non-traditional about it, for sure. So what is the non-traditional narrative? Well, generally speaking, a non-traditional narrative would be a narrative that challenges the comfort or familiarity of a master narrative. But to get more specific, and in preparation for analysis, consider how your selected story is different in terms of at least one of the following. Maybe your story is different in terms of its structure or sequencing. How does your story have an unusual structure? Maybe your story is different or non-traditional in terms of its theme. How is your story thematically non-traditional? Genre, how does your story challenge expectations of genre? story, how is your story unfamiliar or revise a known story, right? So we looked at the examples of the West Side Story being reinvented and revised. The genre, we looked at the gangster genre and how, we had all these different iterations of what the gangster genre is about. Thematically, we looked at how Roma, Alfonso Cuarón's film, really focuses on a Mexican domestic worker, right? Not a very common theme in books or stories or narratives that we've read. With structure and sequencing, we talked about things like, Pulp Fiction in our last module, right? That sort of has this moment that really plays with this notion of time. When we looked at the sort of Navajo storytelling form that, begins and ends in the East. It's almost like a spatial notion of narrative. Medium, we obviously looked at how's your story told through a non-traditional medium. So we looked at obviously at Iñárritu's Carne y Arena style. How is your story told using a distinct and individual style? I just read a book, A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James. And this book is told in all these different voices. It's set primarily in Jamaica, and you have all these different voices with all these different slangs and idiolects and all these different, it's just a very interesting style of novel. Sometimes it's really hard to read because you don't know a lot of these words and these slang terms and these, so really an interesting style, but it's very non-traditional. It's not just one authorial voice, right? Steady throughout. It has this very kind of like theatrical quality to it. Issue or issues, how does your story address a less common issue or look at a more common issue in a new way? So, we looked at Iñárritu and I talked about Roma just a second ago, but Iñárritu and Carne y Arena is really focusing in on migrant experiences and immigrant experiences, refugee experiences. And that's something that isn't so often written about or told about. It takes on a very different issue. Or the way that West Side Story, some of those West Side Stories are taking up the issue more directly of race as it's built into the original West Side Story narrative, but maybe not dealt with as in a very sort of eye-opening way as some people would feel, and therefore redid West Side Story to take up those issues and address them. So those issues can be a way of your narrative being non-traditional. One last thing I'll say is I think we see this when I say something about challenges the comfort or familiarity of a master narrative. I think we see this discomfort coming to the fore when it comes to things like the movement to ban a lot of books, even today. There's a lot of discussion and debate and arguing going over in terms of banning books, particularly from elementary schools, even middle schools, and perhaps even high schools, not so much higher education. And most of the targets of those bans are stories that are not, I would say, traditional stories. They tend to be, as far as the arguments that are going on recently, stories that are African American stories or stories that are LGBTQIA plus stories. And those two in particular, that's not the only books that people are, but that seems to be the primary focus recently. And arguably it's because one of the arguments that is made, or the primary argument that is made, is that parents in many cases don't want their kids to feel uncomfortable. And I think there's a version of being uncomfortable, and I talked about this in the bonfire discussion or the last video workshop. There's a version of being uncomfortable that I think is really valuable and important. But besides that, it just goes to show that narratives not only have power, but they also have master narratives. If they're a narrative that challenges a master narrative, it can be even more significant, right, and impactful in a way that people recognize and that we still appreciate to this day. So looking forward to see where ideas develop. The next time we'll get more into sort of concrete things about analysis and argument and how to develop those things. How do we analyze a narrative? How do we develop a central claim and subclaims and all those things? So looking forward to that. And once again, thanks for taking the time, and thanks for the great conversation and what has been a great class so far this semester. All right, I guess I should also say, have a good spring break, because I will not be back with another video workshop until we're back from spring break. Okay, everybody, take care. Or not. Now take care. Having trouble ending the Zoom.